In less than 24 hours, a 34-year-old East Side man is scheduled to be executed.
Christopher Young admits he was drunk and high when he went into a convenience store and robbed and murdered the owner 14 years ago. The
Night Team's Devin Clark went to Livingston recently and spoke to Young, who says though his time on Earth may be running out, he hopes what he's done while on death row will live on through others forever.
You know, some of the things I was doing in the world, and I've been a gang member all my life. And so I'm like on a collision course for death out there and not caring. I think that if I would have never came to death row, I wouldn't be the individual I am today. I wouldn't be as mature. I wouldn't be able to explain to my daughter's life, like the appreciation of it, because I didn't have any appreciation for life. I wouldn't be able to explain to them that there's a world out there and not just a city, you know. I wouldn't be able to do any of that without death row.
The cold, sterile walls of Texas death row stand as a testament to what it means to be condemned. It's the night of July 16th, 2018, and Christopher Young knows that time has run out. Lying awake on his cot, the silence of his cell presses down on him like a weight too heavy to bear. Less than 24 hours remain until his execution. His thoughts, however, are not consumed by fear. Instead, he's left with a sense of helplessness, a nagging reflection on everything that has led him here. Christopher stares at the ceiling, replaying every mistake he's ever made. He's not the angry 21-year-old who took Hasmukh Patel's life. He's not the gang member, not the addict. Over the last decade, he has tried to become something different, something better. He's mentored other inmates, rejected violence, found religion, and achieved peace. But none of that matters now. The countdown has begun, and with each passing minute, his fate is sealed. Earlier that day, he had stood before the Texas Parole Board, not to beg for his life, but to challenge their judgment. He pointed to the bias in the system, racial injustice, and the fact that others with similar crimes had been granted clemency. He was not asking for sympathy. Instead, he asked for fairness. But the board had not listened. Now, in the stillness of his cell, surrounded by the heavy silence of death row, Christopher prepares to meet his fate. Not because he hasn't changed, but because change came too late. The victim, Hasmukh Patel, a man who came to America for a better life. To understand the tragedy of Christopher Young's story, we must first understand the life that was lost. Hasmukh Patel was 55 years old when he met his untimely end on November 21, 2004. A devoted husband, father, and immigrant, Hasmukh had moved to America in search of a better life. He dreamed of safety, stability, and the opportunity to provide for his family. His small convenience store, nestled in the east side of San Antonio, was more than just a business. It was a testament to his hard work and determination. Hasmukh wasn't just any shopkeeper. He was part of the fabric of his community, knowing his customers by name and offering them a sense of peace with his friendly demeanor. For years, he had served his customers with integrity, earning the respect of all who knew him. He believed in karma, in the quiet dignity of his work, and in building something lasting in this new country. That quiet morning on November 21st, Hasmukh had opened his store just like any other day. But that day, at 9:30 a.m., a stranger walked in, a young man named Christopher Young. Hasmukh's fate was sealed the moment their paths crossed. Christopher Young, the making of a monster. Christopher Young was just 21 years old when he entered Hasmukh Patel's store. His eyes bloodshot, his thoughts clouded by the effects of alcohol and drugs. Christopher wasn't a man of reason that morning. He had spent the weekend in a haze, alcohol, cocaine, and adrenaline coursing through his body, drowning out the pain and confusion that had consumed his life for years. But the truth was, Christopher wasn't really there to rob the store. He wasn't interested in money or material gain. He had no plan, no demands. He walked into that store because deep inside, he was lost. He wasn't a hardened criminal or a mastermind. He was a young man trying to survive in a world that had taught him to fight for everything, even if it meant hurting others. Christopher's past was filled with trauma. At the age of 8, he had lost his father to a senseless murder. That loss shattered everything he had known. His family, already on the edge, fell apart. There was no therapy, no support system to help him process the grief. The world around him continued to spiral, and he fell deeper into it. Without a father figure, Christopher sought comfort in the streets. The gang culture welcomed him with open arms, offering him a sense of belonging, a false promise of protection. The Bloods, a violent street gang, took him in, and by the age of 12, Christopher was entrenched in their world, fighting, dealing, and living a life defined by violence and survival. But what the world saw in Christopher was not just a gang member. He was more than the streets he walked. He was a young boy with extraordinary potential, a talent for music, a natural gift for chess, an intellect that teachers would later describe as brilliant. But none of that mattered. Not in the streets, not in the courtroom. The crime. One shot that changed everything. On November 21, 2004, Christopher walked into Hasmukh Patel's store with a gun tucked under his jacket. What followed was not a robbery. It was a senseless act born from years of rage, trauma, and poor choices. Hasmukh immediately recognized the tension in Christopher. With calm words, he raised his hands in surrender, attempting to de-escalate the situation. But there was no negotiating with Christopher's mind. In one swift movement, the gun was drawn. A shot rang out. Christopher didn't speak another word. He didn't try to take anything from the store. The damage was done. Hasmukh Patel fell, his life extinguished in a split second. Blood spread across the floor, but it was not just Hasmukh's life that was destroyed. It was Christopher's as well. The moment that shot echoed through the store, everything changed. In a daze, Christopher fled the scene, unsure of what he had just done. He wandered the streets, his mind overwhelmed by the magnitude of his actions. Soon after, the police apprehended him. He was found sitting on a curb, shaking, disoriented, and crying. The arrest, the confession, and the beginning of the end. By the time the police caught up with him, Christopher had already begun to understand the enormity of what had just happened. He confessed quickly. He didn't remember firing the gun, but he admitted to the crime. He told the detectives that he was drunk, lost, and deeply sorry. But it was too late. The video surveillance, witness testimonies, and his own confession sealed his fate. Christopher Young was charged with capital murder, and the state of Texas moved swiftly toward its punishment. The victim, Hasmukh Patel, had left behind a grieving family, and the community rallied for justice. But as the case unfolded, the story behind the crime, the story of a young man broken by trauma, addiction, and the streets, remained untold. The trial. The system and its verdict. The trial was quick. The facts were clear. Christopher had confessed. The footage showed him pulling the trigger, and the victim's family was devastated. But the trial didn't just focus on the crime. It focused on Christopher's past, on his gang affiliation, his criminal record, and his association with violence. He was painted as a thug, a menace to society, a young man with no hope of redemption. The defense, however, attempted to show another side of Christopher, one that the jury didn't see. They spoke of his intelligence, his potential, and his early promise as a musician and scholar. They told of a young boy whose father was murdered, whose life was shaped by a cycle of violence and neglect. They argued that Christopher had been a victim of his environment, that he had been failed by the system long before he ever picked up a gun. But the jury didn't see it that way. They saw a killer, and in Texas, killers die. Christopher Young was sentenced to death. Life on death row, the solitary struggle. Christopher's time on death row began in 2006 at the Polinsky Unit, one of the most notorious death row facilities in Texas. For him, this was not just a prison, it was a world of isolation. 23 hours a day in a tiny barren cell surrounded by nothing but silence and concrete. The brutality of the world outside was replaced by an equally brutal solitude inside. At first, Christopher fought back against the isolation. He shouted, he banged on the walls, and he tried to resist the overwhelming silence that pressed in on him. But over time, something began to change. It wasn't the prison system that broke him. It was the silence, the time, and the reflection it forced upon him. Then he met Reginald Blandon, a fellow inmate, who would change his life. Reginald was different from the other men Christopher had encountered. He wasn't hardened by the streets. He was calm, centered, and willing to teach Christopher something he had never known before: peace. Reginald introduced Christopher to books, philosophy, self-help, and works that challenged his view of the world. One book, As a Man Thinketh by James Allen, hit him like a ton of bricks. It spoke of the power of thought, of how a person's mindset shapes their life. Reginald's lessons began to take root in Christopher's mind. He started to reflect on the trauma of his past, on the violence that had defined his life, and on the possibility of change. Christopher began mentoring younger inmates, speaking out against violence and helping guards de-escalate tense situations. He found peace, but it was too late. The system had already sentenced him to death. The final hours, redemption denied. In 2018, Christopher stood before the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. He didn't beg, he didn't cry, he didn't try to play the victim. Instead, he challenged the board. He pointed out the racial biases in the system. He told them that others, white men, with similar or worse crimes, had been granted clemency. He spoke about his transformation, the man he had become behind bars. But the board didn't listen. They voted against clemency, and Christopher's death was set. On the evening of July 17, 2018, Christopher's fate was sealed. He was led to the Huntsville death chamber, his last moments spent reflecting on everything he had been and everything he had become. His last words were soft, almost a whisper. "I've changed, I'm sorry." The needle was injected. The drugs began to take effect. Within minutes, Christopher Young's chest stilled. Christopher Young's story is a tragic reflection of a broken system. A young man with potential, lost to trauma, addiction, and violence, only to find redemption when it was too late. His death is a reminder that the system doesn't always allow for growth or change. It punishes without looking at the possibility of rehabilitation, without considering the long-lasting effects of trauma. In the end, Christopher Young's story isn't just about his crime. It's about what we allow to happen when we fail to address the underlying causes of violence. It's about what happens when the system chooses punishment over redemption.
Well, Taylor Parker has been sentenced to death for capital murder. She was found guilty of murdering 21-year-old Reagan Hancock as well as Hancock's unborn baby girl. The Bowie County jury deliberated for an hour and a half before returning the guilty verdict. Now, back in October of 2020, Parker killed the pregnant mother and cut her unborn baby from her womb. Hancock died at the scene. Her baby was pronounced dead at an Oklahoma hospital.
This is the true story of Taylor Renee Parker, a 27-year-old young lady who took the life of her 34 weeks pregnant friend, Reagan Simmons Hancock, by bludgeoning her with a hammer and cutting the unborn baby from her womb, attempting to steal the child and pass it off as her own. The final moments of life are often the hardest to imagine, until you find yourself standing in the shadow of your own execution. The cold walls of the prison feel even more suffocating when you're staring down your own fate. For some, the execution path is swift. For others, it's an agonizing wait filled with uncertainty. But what really happens in that final hour? What goes through the mind of someone who knows the end is imminent? In this case, we're about to dive into a chilling story where the countdown to death wasn't just a matter of time. It was a harrowing ordeal that stretched the limits of human emotion. A woman who had committed an unimaginable crime now faced the consequences. But the true horror lay in the complex psychological journey she endured while awaiting the executioner's final call. It's not just the criminal who suffers. The victims' families, the public, and even those tasked with carrying out the sentence bear a heavy burden. Imagine knowing the exact moment your life will end, knowing there's no turning back. For some, this knowledge brings peace. For others, it's the very definition of torment. The moment of execution is far more than the physical act. It's a culmination of years of mental anguish, guilt, and deep psychological turmoil. Before we get into the details of this disturbing case, a warning. The story you're about to hear may disturb you. It's a grim journey through the final hours before execution, and it's not for the faint of heart. But before we begin, thank you to everyone who has been with us from the start. Your support, shares, likes, and comments are the reason this channel continues to grow. To our new viewers, welcome. We hope you'll subscribe and join the conversation. Let us know where you're watching from, and together, we can spread awareness of the chilling reality of life on death row. Now, let's take a look at the final moments of a man's life, trapped in the haunting limbo between crime and consequence. The story of Taylor Renee Parker begins in the small, tight-knit community of New Boston, Texas. Born in 1993, she came from a family that on the surface appeared ordinary. Raised in a working-class environment, Taylor had 2 siblings and was described as a quiet child. However, her early life wasn't without struggle. Reports from those who knew her suggest a difficult relationship with her family, especially her mother. Taylor's parents' divorce when she was young deeply affected her. The feeling of abandonment lingered, and many would later describe her as someone desperate for attention and validation. This need for approval would manifest itself in the most disturbing way. In her teenage years, Taylor found herself craving a sense of importance. But despite outward appearances, she was struggling with feelings of inadequacy. She was known to embellish the truth about her life, creating stories about relationships and experiences she never had. As she grew older, Taylor's behavior became more erratic, and her fabrications became even more elaborate. The lies grew to such an extent that it seemed she was building an alternate reality to escape her own feelings of worthlessness. While she had no history of criminal behavior before the murder, her manipulative nature and desire to be seen as something she wasn't began to take shape during these formative years. Those who interacted with her described someone who had an intense need to be loved and admired. Little did anyone know, this would eventually evolve into something far darker. On the morning of October 9, 2020, Taylor Parker's life took a horrific turn. At 27 years old, she had been living a lie for months. She had convinced her boyfriend and those around her that she was pregnant with his child. It was an elaborate deception, one that included fake ultrasound photos, doctored social media posts, and a staged gender reveal party. But as her due date approached, the pressure mounted. In a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion, Taylor decided to take a drastic step. She reached out to Reagan Simmons Hancock, a pregnant woman she had befriended, and lured her into a trap. Reagan, 34 weeks pregnant, had no reason to suspect that the woman she considered a friend would betray her in the most violent way. Taylor brutally attacked Reagan in her home, striking her in the head with a hammer before using a scalpel to perform a grotesque and calculated act. She ripped the baby out of Reagan's womb, attempting to steal the life she had so carefully constructed in her own mind. What happened that day wasn't just a crime of passion, it was an act of cold, premeditated violence. Taylor's obsession with maintaining her pregnancy lie pushed her to a breaking point, where she believed that taking Reagan's child would make everything right. The investigation into the murder began immediately after Reagan's body was discovered. Police quickly linked Taylor to the crime, as she was found with the stolen baby in her arms, still alive but gravely injured. She initially claimed she had found the baby after Reagan had died, but the truth soon came to light. Throughout the investigation, Taylor remained cold and detached, offering little remorse for her actions. In interviews with detectives, she maintained a facade of innocence, sticking to the story she had concocted. Psychological evaluations were conducted, revealing a deeply disturbed individual who had been living in a constant state of deception for years. Experts would later conclude that Taylor's behavior was indicative of severe psychological issues, including narcissistic traits and a lack of empathy. The trial began in September 2022, and the case captivated the public. The prosecution laid out an overwhelming case presenting evidence of Taylor's elaborate lies and the brutal nature of the crime. The defense, however, tried to argue that Taylor's actions were driven by her emotional instability and untreated trauma. The jury deliberated for just 1 hour before convicting her of capital murder. On November 9, 2022, Taylor was sentenced to death. The judge's words were final: "Take her to death row." Despite her conviction, Taylor's legal journey was far from over. As is customary in death penalty cases, she began the lengthy process of appeals, with her defense team challenging various aspects of her trial. Taylor's case sent shockwaves through the community. Reagan's family, who had known Taylor as a close friend, were devastated by her betrayal. The media coverage was extensive, with many wondering how someone so close to the victim could commit such a heinous act. Reagan's family, along with the public, struggled to understand how someone could justify taking another's life for a lie so far-fetched. Since her conviction, Taylor Parker has been on death row at the O'Daniel unit in Gatesville, Texas. She is currently serving her sentence while her legal team works through the appeals process. The Texas death penalty system is notoriously slow and delayed. Parker may spend years, possibly decades, awaiting execution. As of 2025, she is still in the early stages of her appeal, facing a legal battle that could stretch well into her middle age. The community has been left with more questions than answers. How could someone commit such a brutal act based on a lie? How do you reconcile the need for justice with the complexity of mental illness and deception? The case of Taylor Parker is a reminder of how deep the roots of manipulation can go, and how devastating the consequences can be when a person's lies spiral out of control. The last words of a condemned man echo through the sterile walls of the execution chamber. "I am at peace now, but the families I destroyed will never find peace." A final breath, a final apology. This is the end of a story that no one truly wants to hear. But it is the truth, raw and unflinching. Warning: the following content contains disturbing details that may be distressing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome back to our channel, where we confront the most harrowing cases that have shocked our society. If you're new here, be prepared for a deep dive into the darkest corners of crime and justice as we unravel the stories of lives cut short, families torn apart, and the execution of those who committed the unthinkable. Before we begin, we'd like to extend our deepest gratitude to all our subscribers. Your support, whether through likes, shares, or thoughtful comments, has allowed us to continue sharing these stories and shining a light on the consequences of crime. We couldn't have grown this channel without you, and we are incredibly thankful for your commitment to spreading awareness. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Let us know where you're watching from and join the conversation. Today, we begin with a case that will test the limits of your emotions. A chilling story that brings to light the complexities of crime, punishment, and human nature. It is a story of someone who thought they could escape justice but ultimately faced the ultimate consequence. The details are unsettling, and we'll warn you ahead of time. You'll want to brace yourself. Case 1.
A Miami Herald worker is set to be executed by lethal injection tomorrow.
Michael Tansey. Tansey was born on February 27, 1977, in the suburbs of Boston. His early years were marked by instability and trauma. Tansey's father, diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, became increasingly abusive, both physically and emotionally. Reports indicate that his father once slammed Tansey's head into the side of a truck. Additionally, Tansey was sexually molested by a childhood friend. His mother, often absent, struggled to protect him from these abuses. In school, Tansey faced academic challenges and frequent conflicts with peers. By the age of 11, he was resistant to discussing his trauma, even when his mother attempted to take him to support groups for sexual abuse victims. These early experiences likely contributed to his later behavioral issues and criminal activities. On April 25, 2000, Janet Acosta, a 49-year-old production worker at the Miami Herald, was on her lunch break, sitting in her van reading a book. Michael Tansey approached her, asked for a cigarette, and then suddenly attacked her. He punched her in the face, threatened her with a razor blade, and forced her into her van. Tansy drove her to Homestead, Florida, where he bound and gagged her, stole $53 in cash, and used her bank card. They then proceeded to Tavernier in the Florida Keys, where Tansy withdrew money from her account and purchased duct tape and razor blades. Continuing to an isolated area in Cudjoe Key, Tansy informed Acosta he was going to kill her and began to strangle her. He paused to place duct tape over her mouth, nose, and eyes to silence her, before continuing the strangulation until she expired. Tansy then left her body in a secluded area. Acosta was reported missing after failing to return from her break. Police discovered her van in Key West, where they found Tansy in possession of receipts from her ATM withdrawals. Upon confrontation, Tansy confessed to the crime, detailing the assault, abduction, robbery, and murder. He led investigators to the location where he had left Acosta's body. Tansy was charged with first-degree murder, carjacking, kidnapping, armed robbery, and sexual battery. He pleaded guilty to several charges, and in 2003 a jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. Despite multiple appeals, including claims of health issues that could complicate execution, all were rejected. On April 8, 2025, Tansy was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Janet Acosta's family expressed relief and closure following Tansy's execution. Her sister Julie Andrew, who attended the execution, stated, "It's over. Basically, justice for Janet happened." Her niece, Janet Vanderweer, noted that it took nearly 25 years to find closure. The case highlighted the long and often painful journey to justice for victims and their families. Tansy's execution marked the third in Florida in 2025, reflecting the state's continued use of the death penalty. Case 2.
Rejected the appeal of a death row inmate. Michael Mahdi is said to be executed by firing squad Friday.
Mikaldeen Mahdi. At 6:01 p.m. on April 11, 2025, Mikaldeen Mahdi was executed by firing squad at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. Strapped to a chair with a red target over his chest, Mahdi faced the culmination of a life marked by profound trauma and violence. Born on March 20, 1983, in Virginia, Mahdi's early years were marred by neglect and abuse. His father, Sharif, a former Marine who converted to Islam, had a history of alcoholism and violent behavior. In 1991, Mahdi's mother left the family, and he was sent to live with relatives. At age 9, Mahdi was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and briefly committed to a psychiatric facility due to suicidal threats. He spent significant time in solitary confinement during his youth, which is now recognized as a form of psychological torture. These early experiences likely contributed to his later violent behavior. Between July 14 and 17, 2004, at the age of 21, Mahdi embarked on a multi-state crime spree. The series of events began with a drug deal gone wrong in Virginia, leading to the death of Greg Jones. Mahdi then traveled to North Carolina, where he fatally shot convenience store clerk Christopher Jason Boggs during a robbery. On July 17th, he carjacked a man in Columbia, South Carolina, and fled to a farm in Calhoun County. There he murdered 56-year-old off-duty police officer James Myers, doused his body in diesel fuel, and attempted to set it on fire. Mahdi was arrested in Florida while driving Myers' stolen truck and was later extradited to South Carolina to face charges. Mahdi's arrest led to confessions for the murders in North Carolina and South Carolina. In 2006, he was sentenced to death in South Carolina for the murder of Officer Myers. In 2011, he received a life sentence in North Carolina for the murder of Boggs. Mahdi's defense team argued that his difficult childhood and mental health issues were not adequately considered during his trial. Despite appeals highlighting these factors, the South Carolina Supreme Court upheld his death sentence. On March 28, 2025, Mahdi chose to be executed by firing squad, citing it as the lesser of three evils compared to electrocution or lethal injection. His final appeal was denied, and Governor Henry McMaster declined to grant clemency. Mahdi's execution sparked debate over the use of the death penalty and the conditions leading to violent behavior. Advocates for reform highlighted Mahdi's traumatic upbringing and the potential for rehabilitation. The execution was carried out by 3 prison employees who volunteered for the firing squad. Mahdi was pronounced dead at 6:05 p.m., approximately 4 minutes after the shots were fired. His last meal included ribeye steak, mushroom risotto, broccoli, collard greens, cheesecake, and sweet tea. The case remains a poignant example of the intersection between personal history, mental health, and the justice system. Case 3.
Well, tonight, Texas is carrying out its 3rd execution of the year. A jury found Moises Mendoza guilty for the death of Rochelle O'Neal Tolson back in 2004. Prosecutors said Mendoza took Tolson from her home in Farmersville and admitted to strangling, sexually assaulting, and stabbing Tolson. Her body was found 6 days later. Mendoza will die tonight by lethal injection at the state prison in Huntsville.
Moises Sandoval Mendoza. Moises Sandoval Mendoza was born on January 26, 1984 in Mexico. His family relocated to northern Texas during his childhood. Raised in a turbulent environment, Mendoza exhibited troubling behaviors from a young age. Neighbors recalled an incident where he violently pinned down his mother and sister in their front yard. Despite these early signs, Mendoza graduated from high school with decent academic performance and completed approximately 9 months of training in heating and air conditioning after graduation. However, his life soon took a darker turn. In 2003, Mendoza was arrested in connection with 2 aggravated robberies on the Dallas College Richland campus. At the time Rochelle Tolson went missing, Mendoza was out on bail for one of those charges. Just days before the murder of Tolson, Mendoza had attended a small party at Tolson's house with around 15 people. On March 18, 2004, 20-year-old Rochelle O'Neal Tolson was abducted from her home in Farmersville, Texas. Mendoza, an acquaintance from high school, entered her house through an unlocked back door during the night. He claimed that Tolson left willingly with him to get cigarettes, leaving her 6-month-old daughter behind. Mendoza then drove Tolson to a secluded area near his home, where he sexually assaulted her before strangling her to death and stabbing her in the throat. After the murder, Mendoza moved Tolson's body to a more remote location and burned it to hide his fingerprints. Her remains were discovered 6 days later, and dental records were used to identify her. Tolson's disappearance was reported when her mother found the back door of her house wide open and her daughter alone inside. Investigators discovered signs of a struggle and a missing person report was filed. Mendoza was arrested after he reportedly told a friend that he killed Tolson. He confessed to the crime, detailing the abduction, sexual assault, and murder. During the trial, clinical psychologist Mark Vigan characterized Mendoza as emotionally immature and lacking psychological development. The jury also heard evidence of Mendoza's long history of violence against women, including instances of physically assaulting his mother and sister and sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. In 2005, Mendoza was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Mendoza's execution on April 23, 2025, was witnessed by members of Tolson's family. In his final statement, Mendoza apologized to Tolson's family, expressing remorse for his actions. He also addressed his own family, assuring them that he was at peace. The case highlighted the complexities of justice, mental health, and the consequences of violent behavior. It also raised questions about the fairness of the legal process and the application of the death penalty. Case 4.
Well, today, Governor Ivey is setting the next execution on Alabama's schedule. The window opens at midnight on April 24th for James Osgood. The execution window closes at 6 a.m. the following day.
James Osgood. James Osgood, known to friends as Taz, was born in 1970 in Alabama. Raised in a tumultuous environment, he faced early challenges that may have influenced his later actions. His father, a Vietnam War veteran, struggled with alcoholism and post-traumatic stress disorder, creating an unstable home life. Reports indicate that Osgood had a history of substance abuse and mental health issues. Despite these challenges, he had a close-knit group of friends and was known for his sense of humor and loyalty. However, these personal struggles did not excuse his later criminal behavior. On October 23, 2010, 44-year-old Tracy Lynn Brown was found dead in her home in Chilton County, Alabama. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered by James Osgood and his girlfriend, Tanya Van Dyke, who was also Brown's cousin. The pair had discussed fantasies of kidnapping and torturing someone before deciding to act on them. They forced Brown to perform sex acts at gunpoint before Osgood fatally slashed her throat. Van Dyke is serving a life sentence for her role in the crime. Following Brown's death, investigators discovered that she had been last seen in the company of Osgood and Van Dyke. Osgood initially denied involvement but later confessed to the crime, detailing the assault and murder. In 2014, a jury convicted him of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death. However, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the sentence in 2016 due to improper jury instructions. At resentencing in 2018, Osgood requested the death penalty again, stating he did not want to prolong the legal process for the families involved. He voluntarily waived further appeals in 2024, expressing a desire to complete his sentence. James Osgood was executed by lethal injection on April 24, 2025, at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. He was pronounced dead at 6:35 p.m. In his final moments, Osgood apologized to Tracy Lynn Brown, stating, "I haven't said her name since that day. Tracy, I apologize." His attorney, Allison Molman, described him as a man who was more than his worst actions, emphasizing his accountability and remorse. The execution was witnessed by Brown's family members, who chose not to make a public statement. Thank you for joining us in exploring the tragic story of the 4 criminals that were killed in April this year, 2025.
At the time, I was probably as prepared as I could have been, emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually prepared to take the step into my next life. Turned around and says, "Murphy, what's your chances like today?" You know, I told him, I said, "They're thin, really thin." And he says, "Well, you know, that issue with the minister is not going to fly." And I said, "Yes, sir." At 5 o'clock, they come and they take the phone, they take the food, and from then on, you're just waiting, right? Because, you know, they're supposed to start the execution at 6 o'clock. You know, looking into, excuse me, I spent 4 hours looking into the valley of the shadow of death. Yeah. And I stepped back from it. I was really very shocked. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to act. You know, it was like I was relieved, but like I said, at the same time, I was, you know, kind of disappointed. I'm pretty much of the opinion that if I do get a third date, it'll probably be the one. And I'm not trying to deny them. I'm trying to do something, you know, a little bit better now.
A father, sitting in his final hours, awaiting a fate sealed by his own past. His heart races, but not for the reasons you might expect. What is it like to know that the end is near? That the very air you breathe is a countdown to death? The questions loom as Patrick Murphy sits on the edge of his cell, reflecting on the life that led him here. Just hours before his execution, Patrick can still hear the echo of his choices, the decisions that bound him to a group of escapees, to a robbery gone horribly wrong, to a crime that left a family shattered forever. He wasn't the one to pull the trigger, but does that matter when it's your actions that set the course of destruction? In a room not far from where he sits, the family of Officer Aubrey Hawkins waits. A young life cut short, a family forever broken, all because of a series of decisions that spiraled beyond anyone's control. Murphy's actions were part of a greater tragedy, but can we really blame him for everything? Should he be held accountable for a crime he didn't physically commit? The answer isn't so simple, and the law may not care. For nearly 2 decades, Patrick Murphy has lived under the shadow of a death sentence, a fate he could never have fully grasped when his path veered into a life of crime. Tonight, it all ends. But how much of him is still left? And who, really, is the man that sits on death row? Is he the same person that was once a part of the notorious Texas 7, or someone different? But the story doesn't stop there. The lines between right and wrong blur, and in that blur, the murky waters of justice come into focus. The death penalty is a symbol of ultimate punishment, but for Patrick Murphy, is it deserved? Was he a killer in the truest sense, or just another cog in a much larger machine of violence and desperation? Stay with me because this case raises more questions than it answers, and the truth behind it is more unsettling than you can imagine. Before we dive deeper, I want to warn you. The details of this case are disturbing. What you're about to hear may not be for the faint of heart, but it's a story that demands to be told, no matter how uncomfortable. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to the final hour. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if you're a part of our growing family, thank you. Your support, your shares, your likes, and your comments are the reason we continue to bring these chilling stories to light. It's your voice that helps us spread awareness and dive deeper into cases like Patrick Murphy's, shining a light on the dark corners where justice is often questioned. Let's begin. The mysterious case of Patrick Murphy. Patrick Murphy, now 38, was born into a seemingly average family in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Raised by his mother, Grace, and his stepfather, Robert, Patrick's early life seemed typical to the outside world. However, beneath the surface, his family was grappling with issues of substance abuse and financial instability. Patrick's father, who had abandoned the family when Patrick was only 3, left a void in his life. Raised without a paternal figure, Patrick began to feel neglected and often took solace in street gangs, seeking the sense of belonging and purpose that was missing from his home life. His mother, struggling with addiction, was unable to provide the guidance Patrick so desperately needed. By the time Patrick reached his teenage years, his behavior had become increasingly erratic. He was often caught skipping school and engaging in petty thefts. His relationships with authority figures were strained, and school counselors had documented several instances of Patrick displaying violent outbursts. A combination of childhood neglect, the absence of his father, and the toxic environment at home seemed to fuel Patrick's disillusionment with societal rules. Despite brief stints in foster care and several attempts at rehabilitation, Patrick's path seemed preordained. One pivotal incident occurred at the age of 16 when he was arrested for vandalizing a local store. Though the damage was minor, it marked the beginning of his criminal activities. Patrick's criminal trajectory appeared inevitable, especially given the challenges he faced during his formative years. He later admitted in an interview that his troubled youth and early experiences with crime became his coping mechanisms, ways to mask the pain of his upbringing. The year was 2012, and Patrick Murphy, now 28, had just been released from prison for a prior robbery charge. Life outside seemed unkind as he struggled to find work and reconnect with his family. The weight of his past was heavy, and the stigma attached to his criminal record only made things worse. Patrick was living in a dilapidated apartment in downtown. His emotional and mental state was precarious. Feeling abandoned and resentful, Patrick grew increasingly desperate for a way out of his seemingly hopeless situation. A combination of financial distress, personal isolation, and the re-emergence of old acquaintances led to the moment that would change everything. On that fateful night in late September, Patrick entered a local convenience store, a place where he had frequented before. The man behind the counter, an older gentleman named Mr. Hargrove, had known Patrick as a troubled youth but never expected him to be the source of trouble. Patrick approached the counter with a plan. He needed money, and he wasn't going to wait around for an opportunity to come by. His frustration boiled over, triggering a violent outburst. The crime unfolded swiftly. Patrick, in a fit of rage, threatened the store clerk and demanded cash. When Mr. Hargrove hesitated, Patrick struck him. The altercation ended with the elderly man left unconscious on the floor, and Patrick fleeing with the money. It was a crime born of desperation and an overwhelming sense of entrapment. In retrospect, those who knew Patrick from his past were not entirely surprised. His life had been a series of reckless decisions, and this robbery was just another manifestation of his long-standing psychological struggles. The emotional trigger that day was a combination of his inability to find stable work, his deteriorating mental health, and the weight of his past. It was a cry for help, but the response he received was tragically violent. The robbery did not go unnoticed. The local community, though small, quickly became aware of the crime, and a police investigation was launched. Officers quickly zeroed in on Patrick, thanks to witness statements and surveillance footage that captured his face. Within 48 hours, he was apprehended. Patrick was initially calm, but showed signs of distress during the questioning. His behavior was erratic, alternating between remorseful and defiant. He did not offer a full confession, but he did admit to striking Mr. Hargrove, though he claimed that the incident had spiraled out of control. Patrick's defense attorney, Edward Blake, argued that his client had not intended to cause harm. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They highlighted Patrick's prior convictions and a pattern of escalating violence, which led them to believe this incident was not a one-off. During the trial, key witnesses were brought forward. Mr. Hargrove, who had since recovered from his injuries, provided a chilling account of the attack. He described how Patrick had been a regular customer but seemed different that night, distraught, anxious, and unrecognizable in his aggression. Mr. Hargrove's testimony was pivotal, as it painted a portrait of a man broken by years of hardship, lashing out when given the opportunity. Psychological evaluations of Patrick revealed that he had significant unresolved trauma from his childhood, which likely played a role in the crime. The court ultimately found Patrick guilty of aggravated robbery and assault, sentencing him to 15 years in prison. The community was shaken by the crime, as it highlighted the broader issues of mental health and the impact of childhood trauma on adult behavior. The store, once a safe place for the residents, became a symbol of the violence that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most familiar faces. For Patrick's family, the aftermath was just as devastating. His mother, Grace, expressed deep sorrow over the path Patrick had taken, while his stepfather, Robert, tried to reconcile his memories of the boy he had raised with the man he had become. Despite their emotional turmoil, they stood by him, hoping for a chance at redemption. As of 2025, Patrick has served over half of his sentence. His behavior in prison has been described as reflective. He has participated in various rehabilitation programs and counseling. Though he is not yet eligible for parole, there are hopes that he may be released early due to his progress in mental health treatment. Patrick has since become an advocate for those affected by childhood trauma and has expressed regret for his actions. In interviews, he has admitted that the crime was a result of his inability to cope with his emotions and mental health struggles. The road to recovery is long, but Patrick's journey is one of both personal accountability and a desire to make amends. Patrick's case has been discussed in several community forums, and his story has been used as a cautionary tale about the long-term effects of neglect and abuse. His life serves as a tragic reminder of how early influences and unaddressed mental health issues can shape a person's future in ways that may lead them down destructive paths. This tragic case, once seen as just another robbery, now resonates as a story of lost potential and the harsh realities of the criminal justice system. It is a reminder of the complexities that lie behind every crime, of the broken individuals who commit them, and the communities left to pick up the pieces. The story of Patrick Murphy is one of many, but each case is unique, shaped by a lifetime of circumstances, decisions, and emotions that ultimately define the path to redemption or ruin.